This is a project looking at cross-linguistic and cross-cultural similarities and differences in language environments of infants and toddlers. So why do we care about the environment? Hopefully this is a friendly crowd to think that the environment is important for child language development, but just to get us all on the same page. No matter how much of a nativist you are, or an empiricist, everybody agrees that children learn language to a large extent based on the exposure to language input. So Spanish learning babies learn Spanish, and French learning babies learn French. That's, lesson 1 of our child language development classes. But what's really important for us to step back and recognize is that when we say, the input or the environment, we're often talking about really very different things. And so where the nature of theoretical, interesting discussion comes from is, to a certain extent, could be thought of as disagreements in what counts as the input. What are we talking about when we say the environment or the input? So if you're a staunch old school nativist, you might think of it as a list of utterances. If you're Jenny Safran, you were looking at statistical regularities. A more old school Vygotskian approach would be looking at the social context, and there's questions about whether children respond to negative evidence. Typically, we say that that's not a big part of the experience. So those are the reasons why it's really critical to think about what that experience looks like. And then as part of that, there's been, as well as 50 years of research or more on what the input looks like and these theoretical questions, there's been an equally long discussion about the role that a particular type of language input that children are exposed to looks like, and we all know what this is called, child-directed speech. And there's been lots of ink spilled on the question of whether it is universal. It's certainly been described in quite a large number of languages, and to the point where a lot of people would suggest that it's a universal characteristic. At the same time, we're also well aware that there are some counterexamples, at least to the extent that it is a salient or significant part of children's language experiences. And certainly there's been a lot of documentation about more subtle differences across languages and what we mean when we say child-directed speech, or what those characteristics might be, or the strength of those characteristics in different moments. So to summarize a vast literature over 50 years, where we were at this point in time a few years ago was essentially understanding that more language and better quality language input is better for language development, and that's characterized in a lot of different ways. And certainly a growing recognition and lots of support for the idea that speech specifically directed at children, or speech with the characteristics of child-directed speech, and we sometimes sort of conflate those two notions, but they are somewhat separable, is good for children and correlated with language outcomes. And also a recognition of the importance of particularly salient factors like socioeconomic status. So that was kind of the state of the art. And then what's happened more recently is that there have been sort of two advances. I mean, there's been more than two advances, but two salient advances that I think have really impacted where we're at with the ICLU project. So the first advance was a technological advance. And so we've talked already a little bit about Lena. I don't know how familiar everybody in the crowd is with the Lena system. It's becoming a household name in our research field, but essentially, if it's somewhat new to you, it's a little recording device about this big that goes in a pocket in the front of the child's clothing, and they wear it and they go about their day and they just have their regular activities. And then that recording device comes back to the lab, gets plugged into the computer, and out the other end comes some automated measures like the amount of language that the amount of words that the child has been hearing over the course of their day. Okay, so you already saw one graph about how Lena works. This is sort of from a different perspective. So if you look at the waveform, you can see that the software chunks it into speech chunks and silence chunks, which is a little bit what we were talking about doing in the tools talk. But beyond that, it chunks it into smaller segments of speech that are associated with particular speaker classes. So it doesn't identify individuals, but it does identify male adult speaker, female adult speaker, other child, and target child, and those are the main speech classes that it uses in its work. So this was kind of the state of the art 10 years ago in terms of automated speech processing that would be usable for the child language community. So Lena had a lot of advantages. The hardware was kind of the way it was designed to be robust and to allow the child to kind of wander about their day, which was a little different from the way that we'd envisioned recording devices up until that moment. It gave you automated estimates of some very general measures that are useful to us, like how many words the child's hearing, how often the child is vocalizing. It gave you some automated segmentation and this broad class labeling. And importantly, it gave us a snapshot into these children's real world lives. And that was, to me, 10 years ago when this really kind of hit the scene, a salient moment in rethinking what we mean when we think about the child's language environment. But obviously, Lena has some pretty significant disadvantages. One of the most important ones that Florian talked about is the fact that it's a black box and is proprietary software. And as part of that, it has not been developed since it initially came out, and to my knowledge, there aren't any real plans to do any further development on the software. They've sort of changed, the Lena Foundation has sort of changed focus towards these community projects. And therefore, what we have is what we have, and that technology, to the extent that it was state of the art 10 years ago, is now 10 years old, and there's a lot of advances that it's lacking. It also doesn't do some important things that we as a language community are really interested in, such as differentiating child-directed speech and adult-directed speech. It doesn't identify particular speakers, which would be really nice to do, and differentiate between languages. So a lot of people would be interested in using it potentially for bilingual acquisition, and being able to identify different languages would be great for that. So those are some of the disadvantages that we have of Lena. But what it has done is been a real influence in, first of all, in showing us what we could do, what the potential is for doing this kind of automated processing. But also, I really think, at least for me and probably for a lot of other people, it had an impact on thinking about what we mean by the language environment. And so you can see these are a couple. I had to actually, these are from Mitty's research lab, and I had to actually go back and ask her, were these staged or were they not staged? Because they look a little staged to me, but they're not. These are real world language experiences of this child, and here she is in a meal time, right, with her parents. And then at the bottom here you see sort of a free playtime with some toys on the floor where they're having a little family playtime together. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that issue in a little bit. But just to say that this allows us to capture these real-world activities that children are engaged in. So some of the early work that I did with Lena was thinking about activities and, in fact, looking at some things that Lena did not actually capture, so then I had to go in and code them at the same time. But just, and I was at that point looking at differences in child's experiences within a given culture, looking at children who were going into daycares and children who were staying at home. And so I was doing this comparative analysis of different types of activities that they might engage in. And so here, it's not super important that you get this whole graph, but just to see that, you know, at the far end there's sort of a general playtime and then organized playtime, and then there's television experiences, travel time, and a variety of mealtime, other types of activities. And you can see that there's both broad differences in the amounts that the children engage in these activities, as well as differences even within a culture in the extent to which they engage in these activities. And that this has impacts on the, at least the amount of speech that they're hearing as measured by Lena, both across activities. So at the far end that I have circled there is story time, and then in the middle there is mealtime, and so up on top there's adult words, and down below is child vocalizations, and you can see again both differences across activities in the amount that they're hearing adult words and the amount that they themselves are vocalizing, as well as differences in the impact that those activities have on in these different settings that they might be in. And that presumably reflects differences in what we mean by those activities when you're talking about story time at home versus story time in a daycare setting. So we can start to see that these kinds of different, like little tiny contexts that children are engaged in can really matter for their language experiences, at least in this sort of very broad measure that we can get from Lena. So the other thing that I've looked at is how many adults are present. And again, Lena doesn't do this for me, so this had to be coded by notation. And again, unsurprisingly, you see differences in the numbers and also ratios, although I don't have that here, of the number of adults that are present to a given child in 5-minute increments. In homes, these sort of home daycares run out of a woman's home or in these larger daycare centers. And similarly, these kinds of one-on-one periods are also of great interest, one-on-one engagement versus sort of one-to-many or many-to-one types of engagement. So we looked specifically at one-on-one. And unsurprisingly, again, you see differences between daycare centers and homes in the amount of those experiences that children have. But the other thing is that you see, again, differences not only in how number of adults present relates to the amount of speech that they're hearing, but also how that relationship plays out in different contexts. So if you look in the middle here, you can see in the home environment, you see a somewhat linear type of relationship between how many adults are in the room and how much speech the children are hearing. But in the daycare settings, that relationship is not so obvious, right? Okay. So these are some of you may work with Lena and have your own kind of early experiences and the kinds of things that we can do with them. So what we sort of saw as the next step was, okay, so now we have these recordings. What are the strengths that these recordings give us? Well, one thing that we can do is combine across data sets. So we painstakingly collect these recordings within our own labs and get relatively small ends. We can get lots of audio time, but it still ends up being relatively small ends. If we can combine across data sets, then we can sort of build up our data set to be something more robust, both in terms of numbers, but also in terms of the breadth that we can cover. And so our first attempt at this was sort of, this was pre-ICLU, was all North American samples, but at least to kind of get us started in thinking about how these kinds of samples can be combined and used in a meaningful way. So this was a set that was of different corpora that are available in HomeBank, which is a TalkBank data, not corpus, data collection. And I very much encourage you, if you're interested in this kind of research, to get yourself affiliated with HomeBank, and because there's a lot of rich resources and a growing number of resources that are available there. So I've put up the link to HomeBank, and there's my little plug for HomeBank. So these were corpora that were taken from HomeBank, and the age up to 20 months, and we had a total across the corpora 61 participants. So that's a really big number, a really small number, depending on how you think about it. And in this first attempt, we really just used Lena. So initially, so we took 1,220 conversational blocks using Lena's algorithm. So Lena defines a conversation based on a certain amount of non-speech time between each chunk of group of vocalizations. And then we further sort of specified some particular characteristics of those conversations. So they had to have a minimum of 10 adult speech segments within them, so 10 roughly utterances of adult speakers. So this was a conversation, not just one vocalization of somebody or whatever. And then did some further paring down based on some characteristics, and their final data set was slightly less than our 1220, and a total of a little less than 10,000 segments that we classified. So then, as we've already said, and many of you probably know, Lena does not give us child-directed speech and adult-directed speech, and that's what we wanted to look at. So we actually had coders come in and just they listened to the clip and they said, this is an adult speaking to a child or an adult speaking to another adult, clicked a button to say it was ADS or CDS, and then also hand labeled whether it was a male speaker or a female speaker. So just very quickly, and Lena does give male versus female, but we're also partly looking at how good Lena's classification was. So we added that in as well. Okay, so this was really just to look at how much speech these kids are getting and look at how that changes across some other features. So one thing that we looked at, which just to kind of verify that we were consistent with the literature and that this was was making sense, was maternal education level, and as expected, it was somewhat the amount of child-directed speech that children were hearing was somewhat related to the maternal education level, has been found in the previous literature. It wasn't quite as striking as we were kind of expecting it to be, but it's there. And then, so this is sort of the other central graph, and there's kind of a lot here, so I will talk you through it a little bit. So essentially, you have the darker shadings and lines are female speaker, the lighter ones are male speaker, and then the x-axis is child age in months, and then the y-axis on the right-hand side you have proportion of child directed speech. On the left-hand side you have child-directed speech in quantity, so minutes per hour. And then in the middle is adult-directed speech. So a couple things that you can pull out of this. One is that there's more speech coming from women than from men in the sample. It's, again, probably not too surprising. Another thing is that we see an increase in the amount of child-directed speech that these infants are being exposed to as they get older, particularly from the female speakers. But then, if you look at these raw measures on the left-hand side, something a little more interesting emerges, which is that the child-directed speech is actually looking fairly flat over child age, maybe a little bit of increase in the female, but what you're actually seeing is a decrease in raw adult-directed speech over child age, which was sort of pretty darn surprising to us, and we're still sort of trying to interpret what that means. But then what that results in is an increase in the proportion of child-directed speech that these children are hearing. So how you want to interpret that, I don't know. I'm still struggling with what to make of that. We've looked, we've thought about a few ideas what that might mean. I'd be interested in people's thoughts on that. So that was our kind of initial foray into that sort of thing. Oh, I'm running really short on time. Okay. So the second advance was a growing recognition in the research community that there's some pretty significant biases in the way that we think about our research. So as I'm sure is not something that I would have to convince this audience of, there's pretty strong bias towards North American English, and which is also known to have a relatively extreme form of child-directed speech. And so that's obviously playing a role in biases in our theoretical approaches to child language development. There's also this growing recognition sort of more generally of this notion of the weird nature of our data. And I've actually been having some discussions with people recently about the term weird itself and whether the term weird itself is biased in certain ways. But the idea is that, so this is Western educated, industrial rich democratic. And so one of the problems with this term weird is that it sort of leads us towards this binary perspective of you're either weird or you're not weird. There's different ways of defining things like are you educated or are you not educated, depending on where you are. And it also, even though the term weird was intended to sort of break apart this hierarchical sense of North American centricness, it doesn't quite succeed at that sometimes. There's still this idea that if you're not weird, you're still weird in some way, right? It's hard to get around that in the structure of the way that we talk about those things. So maybe, I haven't settled on a better term, but something like cultural biases might be one way to think about this, but yeah. So if we go back to those pictures that I showed you, so here's this, mealtime and this playtime. And I asked some of my ACLU collaborators to give me some pictures from their communities that they study. So here's an Argentine Spanish semi-urban experience, and I love the face plant that the baby's doing on the table there. That's, I think, a universal experience of babies, the face plant. But this is sort of more of a communal meal, and some other kind of more outdoor experiences that may be more common in some communities. And here's a picture of Tzoltol Mayan. This is actually a picture taken from the front of the mother, and the baby's actually on the back of the mother while they're engaged in a group activity of peeling some fruits, apparently. So you can see that just visually that there are some real differences in the sort of canonical expectations of experiences across these communities. Super quickly, there was, related to this issue of differences in language experiences across cultures, there was a fairly influential paper that came out a few years ago looking at a different Mayan community that showed us that while the children in this community were hearing fairly similar amounts of overheard speech to a comparative North American sample, they were hearing much less directed speech directed to them. And one of the other interesting things about this paper was you can see in this graph that over time the amount of child-directed speech sort of converges at around 3 years to what the North American sample was finding. Okay, so it increases over time in this community. Okay, and here's another example, not from the ACLU communities, but of a forager-farmer community, Tsimane. And here you can see, perhaps even more strikingly, a really small amount of directed speech that continues even to a little bit older age, and overall, quite a small amount of speech that these children are being exposed to in this sample. Okay. This sort of emerging set of findings is tending, and some other findings as well, is showing us that child-directed speech, but not adult-directed speech, or overall speech in general, seems to impact language development. And some of these findings are even suggesting that this might be the case even in communities where they seem, at least from our measures, to be exposed to smaller amounts of child-directed speech. So that's kind of a puzzler, a head-scratcher, that's kind of motivating some of at least my thinking around what it means to be the language environment for children. This has sort of brought us to kind of reconfiguring the research question. So we really need to understand what are the real world, not just measured in the lab or measured in these 1-hour samples, where they know they're being recorded. So they know they're being recorded with Alina, but they do have a tendency to more carefully regularly go about their day. What does that actually look like? Do differences within and across communities in these language experiences influence language development? How universal are the characteristics of child-directed speech and these language experiences more general? And how universal are infants' responses to those experiences? And then, of course, there's the important technical problem that we're posed with, which is how do we manage all of the data that we collect? So it's one thing to record the data. It's quite another to do something meaningful with it on a scale that we can work with, and that was what the previous talk was all about. Okay, so ACLU is a collaborative group of child language, we call the data sets people, and automated speech processing, or the tools people, who are motivated by research on audio recordings of infants and young children's real-world everyday language experiences. And this group was originally an offshoot of another group that I want to give a shout out to, which is DARCL. And everybody who is interested in this is more than welcome to join DARCL, which is a mailing list and a group of people that meet online video conferencing once a month. And it's a fun, loose, collaborative group. Okay, so our goals are to examine the similarities and differences. And so there's a number of important subcomponents to these goals. So one is to bring the researchers together, each with their own corpus and their own research questions, under a single framework. One of the most important technical issues that we confront is developing an annotation system for the corpora that is useful for all the researchers for their research goals and also generalizable so that we're comparing apples to apples, at least as best we can when we're comparing across these corpora, and that's what Mitty's going to be telling us about. And then we have as well, so in addition to wanting to use these annotations for our own purposes as researchers, we also fundamentally want to be creating a rich data set that we can then pass off to the tools folks to develop their tools so that in the future we don't have to do this in a hand-coded way. So then the tools side of the group, I think you've already been exposed to what their goals are and some of their early successes, and we're looking forward to those developing further into something that we can use as a research community. So far what we've been working with is these 6 data sets. So the first 3 are North American samples of various stripes. And then we have a British corpus, and then Mitty's Telltale corpus, and then Celia's Argentine Spanish corpus. And you can see that they're kind of a mixed bag. And on the scale of sort of homogeneous to heterogeneous, it's heterogeneous but not, it doesn't cover the spectrum of all of the experiences that children might have, but it at least gives us an eclectic group that we can look at richly. So at the moment, somebody was asking about quantity of speech. So our data set so far that is available for doing analyses is, we have more recordings that are part of the sample, but obviously we're limited by the RA annotation time. So we have N of 10 for most of these samples, and that's ongoing, so there will be more. So that's 1 recording per child so far, and a total recording minutes that were annotated and transcribed for each. You can see for each of the corpora, and then total utterance minutes, which the tools folks often talk about as the actual amount of speech annotation that's available. So sometimes you're annotating a 2-minute sample and there's just silence the whole time, so that wouldn't get counted in that column, right? And then we have, again, a sort of an eclectic age range. Okay. So our questions so far are fairly modest, but we have broader questions that we want to address in the longer term. So the first thing that I'll show you is the one result that I will show you, I guess, is comparing this data set to the data set that I showed you earlier in the North American sample in terms of the raw quantities of ADS, CDS, and the proportion of CDS. So to a certain extent, this is replicating the North American sample, and there's actually a fair amount of overlap between that study, not 100%, and the American samples that we have now for a clue, and then extending this to other language communities. And then we're still looking at raw quantities, so how similar are these raw quantities across language communities? Okay, so we have child age, we have language community, and we have those raw and proportional measures. I do want to make clear that what we mean by raw CDS and raw ADS. So for the speech, all the child and adult speech except the target child is included in these measures. And CDS in this definition, which is different from some other ways of looking at it, includes both target and non-target child-directed speech. So it's overheard child-directed speech is included in this measure. So a bunch of caveats. This is a relatively small preliminary sample. We don't have any statistics run over this yet. I'm just going to show you some pretty graphs. And we're obviously very cognizant of the potential for interpretive pitfalls if we see differences across our language communities in what that actually means, even if it is a robust difference. So please don't cite these as definitive findings. I'm just trying to show you kind of where we're at with this and what we can do with it. Okay, so here's the North American English proportion of CDS. So it's not quite so striking, but at least it's looking promising. You can also see that our coverage of age is not so hot there, so take it with a grain of salt. But it's looking similar to the picture that we saw in our published study. If you look at the raw CDS, again, it's looking fairly flat. And if you squint a little bit, the ADS is kind of decreasing over age. So it's similar, maybe not quite as striking as the original finding, and obviously we need to work some more on the data. And then if we do across all of our all of our data sets, we see something fairly similar. All of our proportion, and then a little decrease over time. And then if I break it out by language group, I'm still sort of playing around with what's the best way visually to show these findings, but I've taken out the dots because it was a little overwhelming. And what you can generally see is proportionally, 3 of the 4 data sets are increasing over time as we would expect. The Argentine Spanish, for some reason, is decreasing over child age. And then everybody's kind of flat in terms of the raw CDS. And then, again, we see the opposite pattern with the Spanish, where we see a little bit of a hint of decrease in ADS, and the Spanish seems to be increasing over age. So there are very preliminary conclusions. We have a somewhat tentative confirmation of what we had originally found in our published study. We see some similar patterns across some other language groups, and a different pattern from the Argentine sample, which was obviously not predicted. So I don't want to say too much about what that means, because that would be just me making stuff up. But interestingly, at least so far in our noisy sample, we have fairly similar quantities and proportions of child-directed speech across the language communities. So we'll see how that holds up with a larger sample. And then importantly, it's just sort of a proof in principle that this approach works. Our first, a year and a half, I guess, of us working together, developing the annotation system that Mitty is going to present, and pulling this together in a meaningful way as a data set. Okay, so there's been some important practical lessons that we've learned from this process that I'd like to share with you. One of them, for me at least, has just been sort of reinforcing to me just how much we have cultural assumptions in the way that we analyze the data and the way that we think about the data. So one really striking example to me is nap time. We want to, a lot of people when they're working with LENA data want to exclude nap time because the recorder's still on, but the baby's asleep, right? So that's not really meaningful language experiences for a baby if they're sleeping while the language experience is happening. So there's lots of different ways of thinking about excluding nap time. A lot of them are sort of based on suddenly everything gets quiet because it's nap time, right? But that's not really an appropriate tool for excluding nap time across all cultures. And in fact, even the idea of having a structured nap time is not necessarily valid across all cultures. How we define SES and how we define education level also becomes a little bit fraught. But even just the process of working across these language communities and figuring out how to compare apples to apples, I think is a really valid and rewarding process. Some other challenges that we've run into have been more related to things like working with sensitive data, either because you're working with a group that has historically or currently concerns about how that group is treated, or because you're running into things in the recordings that might be of concern for the broader research community to hear. And as we move towards more open science kinds of approaches to data sharing, and certainly ACCLU really wants to work as an open sharing kind of group, we are also sort of balancing that against the needs of protecting the participants. So that's kind of an ongoing challenge. And then sort of technical challenges around data storage and sharing across a very disparate group of researchers with different approaches to data usage and storage around the world. Okay. All right, so I think we're running short on time. So so our next steps are, okay, I'll just say quickly with sampling. So far we've been doing random sampling. We'd like to do some other kinds of sampling, and I'd welcome ideas about sampling that you think would be most effective. Ideally, we're going to have tools to be able to run across the whole corpus, but we're not there yet, and obviously we want to look at ways that different types of sampling influence the findings that we get. So we can look at peak adult speech, peak child speech, or sort of more regular types of sampling, or targeting things like activities, like mealtime, but then again, you run into cultural assumptions about what counts as a mealtime. So that's kind of one thing that's still under consideration. So for our next steps, really what we're in at the moment in the project is sort of a massive annotation. Like we've done the work to design the annotation system, and now it's being, and the RAs are trained, and there's just a bunch of annotation occurring. But the more annotation, the better for our tools folks and for us. And then obviously the data that I've shown you so far are fairly limited in what you can say theoretically about them. So we need to look at gender effects, socioeconomic status, also obviously importantly, particularly for some of our communities that we're looking at differentiating targeted and overheard, child-directed speech, looking at the child vocalizations themselves. And so far everything's quantitative. It would be important to start looking at some qualitative differences across these experiences as well. And then, so lastly, if this is going to be really about cross-cultural and cross-linguistic, and if we're going to have enough data for our tools folks to work with, we need more data, and we need more diverse data. And so I'm going to stop there. And next up will be the talk about that. So here are my acknowledgements. Thank you.